The Assassin's Creed franchise has spent nearly 2 decades telling you that assassins are the good guys and Templars are the enemy, but the very first game already proved that was a lie. So today, I'm breaking down the worst villains across the entire series, what made them dangerous, and why some of them were barely villains at all. Starting with the man who started it all, Al-Mualim. Here's the thing about Al-Mualim. He's not just the first villain in Assassin's Creed, he's the blueprint. Every antagonist that came after him either follows the template he set or deliberately tries to subvert it. And the wildest part? He was running the Assassin Brotherhood the entire time. Al-Mualim leads the assassins during the Third Crusade in 1191 AD, and for most of the original game, he's your mentor. He gives you targets, he lectures you about the Creed, he sends Altair on a redemption arc across the Holy Land to assassinate 9 specific targets, and you do it, because why wouldn't you? He literally runs the organization named after the good guys. But here's where it gets complicated. After you eliminate all 9 targets, the game reveals that Al-Mualim has been using an Apple of Eden to control his own assassins. The man preaching free will was stripping it away the entire time. His endgame? Use the apple to create a perfect world free of conflict with himself at the top, which is, the exact same thing the Templars want, word for word, and that's not an accident. The first Assassin's Creed told players in its final hour that the line between Assassin and Templar is basically a suggestion. The guy voiced by Peter Renaday gave you orders, called you brother, and then tried to enslave humanity with ancient alien technology. In 2007, that mentor betrayal hit different. It set the moral ambiguity the franchise would lean into for the next 15 plus years. Al-Mualim proved something the series has never stopped reinforcing. The assassins aren't automatically right, and the Templars aren't automatically wrong. Sometimes the guy holding the apple just picks whichever flag is more convenient. But if Al-Mualim was a wolf in assassin's clothing, the next villain on our list didn't even bother hiding. He just became the Pope. Rodrigo Borgia. Ubisoft looked at the list of history's most powerful people and said, yeah, let's make the Pope a villain. And honestly, it's one of the most ambitious swings the franchise has ever taken. Rodrigo Borgia, historically known as Pope Alexander VI, is reimagined in Assassin's Creed II as the Grand Master of the Italian Templars, and the primary target Ezio spends the entire game hunting down. And what makes him terrifying isn't just his political reach. It's the fact that this man got his hands on both the Apple of Eden and the Papal Staff, which is actually a Staff of Eden, 2 pieces of Eden. At the same time, that's like giving a corrupt politician a nuclear arsenal and then also making him immortal, which is, not ideal. Here's the thing about Rodrigo that separates him from Al-Mualim. Al-Mualim was a philosopher who happened to find an artifact. Rodrigo Borgia built an entire empire specifically to acquire them. He weaponized the Catholic Church itself, using papal authority, Vatican resources, and an international network of Templar agents to consolidate power across Renaissance Italy. Every cardinal, every bishop, every political ally was a chess piece. The man literally became pope not because he wanted spiritual authority, but because the Vatican sat on top of an Isu vault. He cheated his way into the papacy so he could unlock a door. And the dynasty he established didn't stop with him. Rodrigo fathered both Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia, meaning his bloodline of villainy stretches across 2 full games. That's a family legacy most Templar grandmasters could only dream of. But here's where it gets complicated. His dual artifact possession raises a question the series keeps dancing around. Was Rodrigo Borgia genuinely this corrupt, or did prolonged exposure to Isu technology warp him into something worse? The historical Borgia was already notorious for bribery, nepotism, and murder, but the game suggests the artifacts amplified what was already there. Turns out, giving a power-hungry Pope alien technology doesn't exactly bring out his charitable side. Ezio finally confronted him beneath the Sistine Chapel in 1499, beating him into the ground and stripping him of both artifacts. But then Ezio did something nobody expected. He spared him, decided killing a broken old man wasn't worth it. Noble? Sure. Smart? Not exactly, because his son was already worse. Cesare Borgia. Most Assassin's Creed villains hide behind desks, pull strings from the shadows, and let their underlings do the dirty work. Cesare Borgia looked at that playbook and set it on fire. This is the first antagonist in the entire series who fights you on completely equal footing, and it changes everything about how Brotherhood plays. See, Rodrigo Borgia was a schemer. He sat in the Vatican, hoarded pieces of Eden, and used political influence to stay untouchable. His son inherited all of that infrastructure and then decided it wasn't enough. Cesare didn't just want to control Rome from the papal apartments. He wanted to conquer it, publicly, with armies. And he had the tools to do it. As Duke of Romagna, Cesare commanded military forces across central Italy, turning the Borgia name from a political dynasty into an occupying empire. He wielded the Apple of Eden, a piece of Isu technology that put him on a level no previous villain had reached. This isn't some guy sitting in a vault waiting for you to sneak in through a window. This is a warlord with ancient technology and a standing army who's actively expanding his territory while you're still recruiting assassins off the street. That's what makes Brotherhood's structure so different. The conflict escalates from targeted assassinations into open warfare. You're not just hunting one man, you're dismantling an entire military operation. The assault on Castel Sant'Angelo requires the full weight of the Brotherhood to pull off, which is a first for the series. Before Cesare, every final confrontation was a solo infiltration. He forced Ezio to build something bigger than himself just to compete. Here's the thing. Rodrigo was the Pope. He should be the more intimidating villain on paper, but fans consistently rank Cesare above his father as the more compelling antagonist. The dynamic between him and Ezio feels competitive in a way no previous game achieved. Two leaders, two organizations, both growing in power simultaneously. It's not predator and prey, it's a war between equals, and that competitive energy is exactly what makes Brotherhood's narrative hit harder than AC2 for a lot of people. But speaking of antagonists who redefine how you experience an entire game, Haytham Kenway didn't just match the protagonist. He literally was one. Haytham Kenway. Assassin's Creed 3 did something no game in the franchise had done before. It made you play as the villain, and you didn't even know it. The game opens in 1754, and you're controlling this charming, well-spoken British gentleman named Haytham Kenway. He's capable, he's likable, and you spend a solid 3 to 4 hours doing missions as him, recruiting allies, building a network, settling into colonial America. It feels like a standard Assassin's Creed opening. You're the hero, obviously. Then the game pulls the rug out from under you. Haytham Kenway is a Templar. Not just any Templar, he's the Grand Master of the Colonial Rite. Every ally you recruited, Templars, every mission you completed, you were building the enemy's infrastructure. The game literally tricked you into rooting for the bad guy, and most players didn't see it coming. But here's where it gets complicated. A lot of players never stopped rooting for him. Haytham isn't a cackling supervillain. He's measured, intelligent, and genuinely believes that order and structure will save humanity from itself. When the game shifts to his son Connor, the actual assassin protagonist, something weird happens. Connor is righteous, sure, but he's also stubborn, naive, and often makes things worse. Meanwhile, Haytham is over there making pragmatic decisions that kind of make sense. The father-son dynamic is the emotional core of the entire game. Connor has to reconcile the fact that his greatest enemy is his own father. There's no version of this story where both of them win, and the game knows it. Connor eventually assassinates Haytham at the climax of AC3, his own father, and the moment doesn't feel triumphant. It feels hollow, which is, not ideal for the guy who's supposed to be the hero. The community has debated this for over a decade. Was Haytham actually wrong? The assassins preach freedom, but their methods are chaotic and leave power vacuums. Haytham preached control, but his version of peace had a functioning blueprint. Some players walked away from AC3 genuinely believing the Templars had a point. That's not an accident. Haytham Kenway isn't the most evil villain in Assassin's Creed. He might not even be a villain at all. But he's the one who proved the series could be more than good guys versus bad guys. And that's exactly what makes him dangerous. But if Haytham represented the Templar ideology at its most reasonable, his right-hand man represented it at its most brutal. Charles Lee. Charles Lee is the guy you're supposed to despise while the game is busy making you feel weird about his boss. And honestly, he does a pretty good job at being hateable. The problem is that's basically all he does. In Assassin's Creed 3, Charles Lee serves as Haytham Kenway's most loyal subordinate, a Templar enforcer who carries out the dirty work Haytham's too composed to handle directly. He's the blunt instrument to Haytham's scalpel. Where Haytham debates philosophy and questions the nature of freedom, Charles Lee burns villages and orchestrates civilian massacres. He's not interested in moral complexity. He just wants power, and he's willing to hurt literally anyone to get it. Here's the thing. The real Charles Lee was a Continental Army general whose actual military career included enough controversial decisions and accusations of insubordination that Ubisoft didn't have to invent much. The game takes his documented ruthlessness and cranks it up by layering Templar conspiracy on top. Enslavement operations, attacks on native communities, systematic brutality. The line between this actually happened in colonial America and this is fictional. Templar evil gets blurry fast, which is exactly what the game wants. But here's where it gets complicated. Connor spends the entire game chasing this man, years of his life, multiple sequences, all building toward putting a blade in Charles Lee, and when you finally catch him, it should feel like the emotional peak of the whole story. For a lot of players, though, it just feels like checking a box. Because the real emotional weight of AC3 lies in Connor's relationship with Haytham, not his rivalry with Lee. The community has debated this for over a decade. Charles Lee exists primarily to make Haytham look sophisticated by comparison. He's the Templar you can hate without guilt, so the game can ask harder questions about the Templar you maybe shouldn't hate at all. It's a valid narrative choice, but it means Lee ends up feeling like a punching bag with a tricorn hat. Not every villain needs moral gray, but they do need to feel complete. Sometimes the secondary antagonist's entire job is to make the primary one shine brighter. By that standard, Lee succeeded. But as a standalone villain, he's the weakest link in AC3's chain, which is not ideal when you're the guy the protagonist dedicates his entire adult life to killing. But if you think an underdeveloped Templar subordinate is frustrating, wait until you meet a Templar governor who somehow manages to be even more forgettable while running the entire Caribbean. Laureano de Torres y Ayala. Laureano de Torres y Ayala is the most forgettable main villain in one of the most beloved games in the entire franchise. And that's not an insult to him specifically, it's just what happens when you put a bureaucrat in a pirate game. Black Flag came out in 2013 and immediately became the fan favorite for one very simple reason. It let you be a pirate. You could sail the open Caribbean, board ships, drink with your crew, and hunt great white sharks for absolutely no reason other than the fact that you could. The game was a pirate fantasy first and an Assassin's Creed game second, and Laureano paid the price for that. See, on paper he's actually a solid antagonist. He's the Templar governor of Cuba, running colonial operations out of Havana during the golden age of piracy. He controls shipping routes, military garrisons, and mercantile networks across the entire Caribbean. He's not some cackling madman with a doomsday weapon. He's a pragmatic colonial administrator who understands that real power comes from infrastructure, not spectacle, which is, historically accurate and completely boring to play against. Here's the thing about grounded villains. They work great in grounded games, but Black Flag isn't a grounded game. It's a game where Edward Kenway, a Welsh pirate with zero assassin training, stumbles into the Brotherhood by accident and spends most of the story chasing personal glory instead of fighting Templars. The entire narrative is split between here's the Templar conspiracy threatening the Caribbean and hey look, Blackbeard is your drinking buddy now. Guess which one players cared about more. Laureano's assassination is technically a major story objective. You infiltrate Havana, you take him down, it's a whole thing. But ask any Black Flag fan what they remember about the game, and they'll tell you about sea shanties, naval combat, and the ending that made them cry. Nobody's out here saying, man, remember when we killed that governor? What a moment. He's the villain equivalent of doing your taxes during a music festival. Competent, necessary, and completely invisible next to everything else happening around him. But if you think being overshadowed by pirates is bad, wait until you meet the villain who got overshadowed by his own game's bugs. Francois Thomas Germain. Francois Thomas Germain is the smartest villain in Assassin's Creed that nobody remembers. And that's not his fault. It's Ubisoft's. Here's the thing, most Templar leaders in this series follow a pretty standard playbook. Accumulate power, suppress the masses, control from the shadows, repeat. Germain looked at that playbook, threw it in the garbage, and did something genuinely brilliant. He didn't try to stop the French Revolution. He didn't try to crush the uprising or maintain the old order. He weaponized the revolution itself. He took the chaos, the anger, the guillotines, the entire ideological upheaval of 1789, and steered it toward Templar ends. The people thought they were fighting for liberty. They were fighting for him. That's not just villainy. That's political sophistication on a level this series has never really matched. Every other Templar Grandmaster wants to control society by sitting on top of it. Germain figured out you could control society by pretending to tear it down. He manipulated the ideals of freedom and equality into tools for consolidating Templar power, which is, not ideal for the whole liberty, equality, fraternity crowd. On top of all that, he wielded a Sword of Eden, an Isu artifact that gave him serious combat advantages, so even when Arno finally corners him, it's not a simple fight. The man had ancient technology backing up his already terrifying intellect, but here's where it gets tragic. And I don't mean in-game tragic. Unity launched in November 2014, and it was, to put it gently, a disaster. Faces without skin, characters falling through the floor, frame rates that made the game look like a PowerPoint presentation about the French Revolution. Players were so busy dealing with a broken product that Germain's entire arc got buried under a mountain of bug reports and refund requests. The irony is almost poetic. A villain whose entire strategy was hijacking a revolution got completely overshadowed by a different kind of revolution, one involving millions of angry gamers demanding answers from Ubisoft. The community remains split on him to this day. Players who actually pushed through Unity's technical nightmare generally acknowledge that Germain's concept was genuinely innovative. Those who bounced off the game after 3 hours of watching Arno clip through solid walls barely remember he exists. The game's stripped-down modern-day segments didn't help either, cutting off another avenue where his story could have breathed. It's a shame. Germain deserved a better game around him, but if you think a smart villain getting wasted by poor execution is bad, wait until you meet the one who had every advantage and still couldn't make it work. Crawford Starrick. Most Assassin's Creed villains want to control the world through ancient artifacts or military conquest. Crawford Starrick just wants to control the economy, which, if you think about it, is significantly worse. Starrick is the primary antagonist of Assassin's Creed Syndicate, set in 1868 Victorian London, and he operates unlike any Templar before him. He doesn't command armies, he doesn't lurk in shadowy temples, he runs factories, he controls banks, he owns the police, the politicians, and the organized crime networks that keep the entire city functioning on his terms. He's a Templar Grandmaster who realized you don't need a sword when you have debt, child labor, and a monopoly on industry, and that's what makes him genuinely unsettling. Every other Templar in this series feels like a villain from a different century, because they are. Starrick feels like a villain from right now. His entire operation is built on exploiting workers, weaponizing poverty, and ensuring that the people at the bottom stay there. He doesn't need an apple of Eden to control London. He has capitalism. The apple would honestly be a downgrade. He does possess a piece of Eden, the Shroud, which grants him enhanced abilities during his final confrontation with Jacob and Evie Fry. But the Shroud almost feels like an afterthought. His real power was always systemic. He built an empire out of exploitation long before any ancient artifact entered the picture. Starrick is played by Mark Strong, and the casting alone elevates this character from solid antagonist to genuinely memorable. Strong brings this calm, aristocratic menace to every line, like a man who's never had to raise his voice because the system does his screaming for him, which is, not ideal. Here's something the game never explicitly states. Starrick is basically a prototype for Abstergo, the modern Templar corporation that controls pharmaceuticals, entertainment media, and global finance. Starrick was doing all of that in 1868 with gas lamps and top hats. He's the evolutionary link between historical Templars swinging swords and modern Templars filing patents. The criticism, and it's fair, is that Syndicate sometimes forgets he exists. Jacob and Evie's sibling rivalry takes center stage so often that Starrick feels like he's waiting in the wings of his own game. You'll go 3 missions focused on the twins bickering before remembering there's a capitalist supervillain running Victorian London. He deserved more screen time. Mark Strong deserved more screen time. But even with limited presence, Starrick lands harder than villains who got twice the development, because his methods feel real. Child labor, wage exploitation, systemic corruption. These aren't fantastical Templar schemes. These are Tuesday, but if you think a villain who feels too real is bad, wait until you meet one who doesn't feel like anything at all. Flavius Metellus. Flavius Metellus is the most important villain nobody remembers. And I mean that literally. Ask someone to name the main bad guy from Origins and you'll get a blank stare, maybe a guess at Cleopatra, possibly just the word Egypt followed by a shrug. But here's the thing. What Flavius represents is arguably more significant to the Assassin's Creed franchise than any individual villain in the entire series. Let me explain. Flavius isn't just some guy you stab at the end of Origins. He's the leader of the Order of the Ancients, operating in Ptolemaic Egypt around 49 BCE. That's not a typo. 49 BCE. The Templar Order, as we know it, doesn't formally exist for over 1,000 years after this guy is already running the playbook. Same ideology, same obsession with control, same fixation on Isu artifacts. He's walking around ancient Egypt with technology that predates human civilization, using it to consolidate power in exactly the way every Templar Grandmaster would for the next 2 millennia. And that's the point. Origins used Flavius to completely rewrite the franchise timeline. Before this game, the Assassin-Templar War felt like it had a starting point somewhere in the medieval period. Flavius pushed it back thousands of years. Suddenly, this wasn't a conflict between two organizations. It was an eternal philosophical struggle baked into human civilization itself, tied directly to Isu manipulation and their leftover toys. Now here's where it gets genuinely interesting. The lore community still can't agree on what the Order of the Ancients actually is. One camp says, it's the Templar Order full stop. Direct lineage, unbroken chain, same organization wearing a different hat in a different century. The other camp argues it's a coincidental ideological parallel, two groups arriving at the same conclusions independently because Isu technology pushes people toward the same corrupted logic no matter what era they live in. Origins intentionally never answers this question, which is either brilliant world building or a convenient dodge, depending on how generous you're feeling. Flavius himself, as a character, is honestly kind of forgettable. His boss fight is fine, his dialogue is fine, everything about him is fine, but as a lore keystone, he's irreplaceable. He's the canonical proof that this war has no beginning, and if it has no beginning, it probably has no end either, which is, not ideal for anyone hoping the assassins eventually win. But if Flavius quietly rewrote the timeline from ancient Egypt, the person pulling strings in ancient Greece made the whole thing even more complicated. Aspasia is one of the most fascinating villain concepts in the entire franchise. A real historical intellectual, a woman who held genuine influence in ancient Athens, reimagined as the secret puppet master behind an entire cult spanning Greece. On paper, that's incredible. In practice, the game buries her under approximately 50 hours of content before you even figure out she matters. Here's the thing. The real Aspasia was a courtesan and philosopher who lived from around 470 to 400 BCE. She was one of the most influential women in ancient Athens, closely associated with Pericles, and respected for her intellect in an era that gave women zero respect for anything. Odyssey takes that foundation and turns her into the hidden leader of the cult of Cosmos, pulling strings across the entire Peloponnesian War. A female Templar mastermind in a franchise that almost never gives women that role. That's genuinely compelling. But the game actively works against her. Odyssey's cult system has you hunting down dozens of cultists across an absolutely massive map. You're tracking down branch leaders, unmasking hidden members, dismantling the organization piece by piece, and somewhere in the middle of all that busy work, you're supposed to care that there's one person sitting at the top orchestrating everything. The problem is you've spent so long killing random cult members in random caves that by the time Aspasia's role becomes clear, it feels less like a dramatic revelation and more like checking off the final box on a very long to-do list. The reveal itself is actually smart. The game frames her as a tragic historical figure for most of the story, someone caught up in political chaos, before pulling the rug out. That narrative inversion works on a conceptual level, but the mechanics don't support it. When your villain reveal competes with a checklist of 42 other cultists for the player's attention, the impact gets diluted. It's like revealing the final boss of a mystery novel on page 800 of a 900-page book where you've already solved 40 smaller mysteries along the way. Aspasia deserved a tighter game. She's proof that a brilliant antagonist concept means nothing if the structure around it doesn't let the player feel her presence. The idea of a powerful woman secretly controlling ancient Greece through Isu artifacts and cult networks is exactly the kind of story Assassin's Creed should tell. Odyssey just told it in the most roundabout way possible, but if you think a villain getting lost in their own game is frustrating, wait until you meet one who breaks the entire framework of what an Assassin's Creed villain even is. Basim Ibn Ishaq. Every villain on this list has one thing in common. They're human. Human motivations, human ambitions, human flaws. Basim ibn Ishaq looked at that tradition and said no thanks. I'm actually a Norse god wearing a person like a suit. Here's the thing about Basim. When you first meet him in Valhalla, he seems like a standard hidden one. He's charming, helpful, fights alongside Eivor, offers guidance like any good Brotherhood ally would. He feels like a friend, and that's exactly what he wants you to think. Because Basim isn't really Basim, he's Loki. The actual Isu entity known as Loki, reborn into a human body, through Isu reincarnation technology, carrying thousands of years of cosmic grudges that have absolutely nothing to do with assassins, Templars, or anything remotely human. Let me explain why this breaks everything. Every antagonist before Basim operated within the framework. Templars want control, assassins want freedom, pieces of Eden are tools both sides fight over. Simple, clean. Basim doesn't care about any of that. His entire motivation is rooted in Isu mythology, in conflicts between beings who viewed humanity as livestock. He manipulates Ivor not because of ideology, but because Ivor is the reincarnation of Odin, and Loki has beef with Odin that predates human civilization. The entire philosophical war that defined 12 games. Just convenient cover, and here's where it gets uncomfortable for longtime fans. Basim wins. He doesn't die in a dramatic final confrontation. He doesn't get a hidden blade through the neck while delivering a philosophical monologue. He escapes into the modern day, takes control of the narrative, and becomes a major character going forward. One of the only AC antagonists to simply walk away from his own game breathing. The community is genuinely split. Lore enthusiasts who've tracked the Isu storyline since the glyphs in AC2 think Basim is the most ambitious antagonist the series has ever attempted, 13 years of cosmic breadcrumbs finally paying off. But players who fell in love with the historical grounding, the Assassin-Templar ideological war, they see Basim as the moment the franchise lost the plot, literally. Because if the real conflict was always ancient space gods manipulating humanity from behind the curtain, then what were the last dozen games actually about? Were the Templars ever the real enemy? Or just puppets too? Basim doesn't just challenge the formula. He suggests the formula was always a lie. Whether that's brilliant or narrative self-destruction depends on what you wanted Assassin's Creed to be, but either way, Basim represents where the franchise is heading. The age of simple human villainy might be over, which is ironic because the most important villain in the entire series was never an ancient god, never a Renaissance pope, never a revolutionary or a crime lord. He was just a scientist in a lab coat, and he was there from the very beginning. Warren Vidic, here's the thing about Warren Vidic. He's not a swordsman. He's not a general. He doesn't wield a piece of Eden or command armies. He's a scientist in a lab coat with a clipboard and zero combat ability. And he is, without question, the most important antagonist in the entire Assassin's Creed franchise. Let me explain. Warren Vidic invented the Animus. That's it. That's the whole argument. Every historical period you've ever explored, every hidden blade kill, every synchronization point you've climbed across 15 years of games exists because this man built the machine that makes it possible. He's not just a villain in the story. He is the story. Without Vidic, there is no Assassin's Creed. You're just a guy named Desmond sitting in a room. He first appeared in 2007, standing over Desmond Miles in that sterile Abstergo facility, and he didn't leave for 5 years. 5 games of being the persistent thread connecting Altair's crusades to Ezio's renaissance to Connor's revolution. He extracted genetic memories and pushed the Animus program forward with the cold efficiency of a man who genuinely believed he was saving humanity. Before Desmond, he ran Subject 16, Clay Kaczmarek, whose fragmented consciousness ended up haunting the Animus like a digital ghost. Vidic worked that man until his mind shattered, then moved on to the next subject like he was swapping out a hard drive. And here's where it gets complicated. Every player who ever groaned during a modern-day segment, every person who mashed through Desmond's dialogue to get back to the historical stuff, was essentially complaining about the one villain whose plan actually worked. Vidic wanted to use the Animus to control history, and for 5 straight games, he did exactly that. He controlled your experience. He decided which memories you accessed. The guy was running the show the entire time, and most players were too annoyed by his cutscenes to notice. Desmond finally killed him in Assassin's Creed 3. 1 bullet, no boss fight, no dramatic sword duel, just a gun and a dead scientist. Which is, not ideal for a 5-year narrative payoff. Some players felt it was the earned conclusion of a slow burn rivalry building since 2007. Others felt like they'd invested half a decade into a storyline that ended with a whimper. Both sides have a point, but what nobody debates is what happened after. The series killed Vidic, killed Desmond, and then spent the next decade trying to figure out what the modern-day storyline was even supposed to be anymore. They never found a replacement that stuck. Vidic represents the original vision. The idea that Assassin's Creed wasn't just a historical playground, but a sci-fi conspiracy thriller with ancient technology, corporate espionage, and a modern protagonist caught between 2 secret organizations. That was the pitch. That was what made AC different from every other open world game. And the guy holding it all together was a middle-aged scientist who never threw a single punch. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't scary. He was just always there, quietly running the machine that made everything work. And when he was gone, something went with him that the series has never fully gotten back. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.